Welcome to Matters Financial with Geopolitical from a Frontier, and thank you for stopping by. I apologise for Friday, but I was out of town. I'll tell you about that momentarily. We've uploaded the Mindspeak session with the East African Community Secretary General, Dr. Richard Sasibera, and I was going back through some of the photographs, and he said, "When China speaks, the world listens." And he was referencing Africa's 55 different post boxes. I'd like to thank Sanjeev Shah and his team at RMA Kenya for organising a wonderful weekend in Johannesburg. I'll put up a photograph of the Johannesburg sunset. I called my weekend piece Snapshots from South Africa and its role in Africa's economy. The folks at Jaguar Land Rover very kindly invited me to Johannesburg this weekend with the promise that we would get to drive their entire suite of Jaguars and Range Rovers around the Kyalami racetrack. The Jaguar simply purred. I'll put up a photograph of one of them. It's a fantastic car. We stayed at the Fairway Hotel and Golf Resort, which transpired to be in the epicenter of the Afrikaner heartland in Johannesburg. On Friday night, we found ourselves in a happy hour with Africa's white tribe. It was a curious experience and a very tribal one. I kept saying to my companions that I wanted to make a documentary. As we were driving extremely fast between speed cameras, I noticed how much cheaper the cost of living appeared in South Africa when compared to Kenya. I admit the analysis might not be empirical, but I am certain it's the case. It is widely expected, and I wrote this on Sunday before the rebasing decision was published. A rebasing of Nigeria's GDP will see Nigeria overtake South Africa as sub-Saharan Africa's largest economy. Writing this from Johannesburg, having driven a very fast Jaguar at a very fast speed on South Africa's roads, I could not help but marvel at South Africa's infrastructure, which is simply leaps and bounds ahead of anywhere else south of the Sahara. The manufacturing sector is also far more advanced. South Africa is a big beast on the continent, notwithstanding a softness around recent growth. President Jacob Zuma and the ANC will be facing an election very shortly, and a number of pundits expect the ANC vote to fall below 60% for the first time, as do I. President Zuma has been entangled in a series of scandals and argues that South Africans have never had it so good. Therefore, he argues, the recent fall-off in support is due in part to the fact, this is what he says, that the ANC have been so successful that the electorate have now set exceedingly and impossibly high expectations. Interestingly, South Africa Inc. is taking a much more forward position across the continent. The South African Rand has been a global proxy for risk. It's a practically knee-jerk reaction. If the world looks a more dangerous place, people the world over just sell the Rand. And similarly, folks buy the Rand when folks feel confident about the world. The Rand fell about 20% in January 2013 through February 2014. It has rebounded sharply in the last 2 weeks. I think the adjustment lower in the Rand is set to prove quite supportive for South African exports. The Rand appears to have snapped a more than 12-month downtrend, and that is a constructive forward indicator. The South African All-Share Index closed at a record high on Friday and is plus 5.83% this year. President Zuma has intervened, and apparently decisively, on the side of President Kabila in the eastern Congo. Zuma and the AU had, of course, been unable to land in Libya when seeking to negotiate with Muammar Gaddafi. Therefore, Nigeria rebasing or not, South Africa plays a heavyweight role in sub-Saharan Africa, and its economy is stabilized, in my view, and is improving. I'll put up a photograph of the Johannesburg sunset seen on Friday evening. I'll put another photograph up of the Kyalami racetrack in Johannesburg, and finally a photograph of myself in a rather fast car, I must admit, which I thoroughly enjoyed driving. My macro thoughts are that you should buy more Russian equities. My home thoughts, I saw this photograph from 1950 of a girl skipping, and it reminded me of my Hannah. Political reflections, this is referring now to the the Africa-Europe summit, which was held in Brussels. Africa Confidential says, confounded low expectations and produced agreements on security and migration, but failed again on trade. Africa Confidential is saying that this is a year replete with African summits in China, India, and the United States, indeed. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta looked relaxed despite a spat with Brussels over a visa for his head of security, Edward Bugwa. And I heard that sort of firsthand because Ambassador Uhuru is a good friend. Not everyone was happy to see each other. Spanish media focused on a clash between Equatorial Guinea's Teodoro Obiang and Spain's Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy. They had been seated together on the Lusophone table at the banquet on the 2nd of April summit dinner, but Rajoy declined to break bread with Obiang and was moved, saying that diplomatic bureaucrats turned down the volume on political matters and extolled the business and security side of relations. The summit produced a 63-clause declaration, as well as provisions for continental cooperation on migration and mobility. President Paul Kagame is set to light a torch which will burn for 100 days, the length of time the genocide lasted. He was, of course, a super guest at Mindspeak. I'll put up the link. And when I was in Kigali, and someone took a photograph of us, and I said, there is nothing like a dream to create the future. And indeed, in that period, I think it's 20 years since the genocide, really a future has been created. Louise Mushikiwabo, the foreign minister, was also a guest at Mindspeak. That link is on the website as well. Rahul Gandhi, leader of India's ruling Congress party, waves from the stage at a rally in Delhi. I'm afraid it's curtains for the Gandhis. Seymour Hersh, in the London Review of Books, has written a very interesting piece, The Red Line and the Rat Line, Seymour Hersh on Obama, Erdogan, and the Syrian rebels. In 2011, Barack Obama led an allied military intervention in Libya without consulting the US Congress. Last August, after the sarin attack on the Damascus suburb of Ghouta, he was ready to launch an allied airstrike, this time to punish the Syrian government for allegedly crossing the red line he had set in 2012 on the use of chemical weapons. Then, with less than 2 days to go before the planned strike, he announced he would seek congressional approval for the intervention. The strike was postponed as Congress prepared for hearings and subsequently cancelled when Obama accepted Assad's offer to relinquish his chemical arsenal in a deal brokered by Russia. Why did Obama delay and then relent on Syria when he was not shy about rushing into Libya? The answer lies in a clash between those in the administration who were committed to enforcing the red line and military leaders who thought that going to war was both unjustified and potentially dangerous. Obama's change of mind had its origins at Porton Down, the defense laboratory in Wiltshire. British intelligence had obtained a sample of the sarin used in the 21st August attack, and analysis demonstrated the gas used didn't match the batches known to exist in the Syrian army's chemical weapons arsenal. The message that the case against Syria wouldn't hold up was quickly relayed to the US Joint Chiefs of Staff. As a consequence, the American officers delivered a last-minute caution to the president, which in their view eventually led to his cancelling the attack. For months there had been acute concern among senior military leaders and the intelligence community about the role in the war of Syria's neighbours, especially Turkey. Prime Minister Erdogan was known to be supporting the al-Nusra Front, a jihadist faction among the rebel opposition, as well as other Islamist rebel groups. We knew there were some in the Turkish government, a former senior US intelligence official, who believed they could get Assad's nuts in a vice by dabbling with a sarin attack inside Syria and forcing Obama to make good on his red line threat. Turkey and Saudi-based chemical facilitators, and that's another report. Last May, more than 10 members of the al-Nusra Front were arrested in southern Turkey with what local police told the press were 2 kilograms of sarin. The officer ultimately responsible for the planning and execution of the attack was General Martin Dempsey. From the beginning of the crisis, the former intelligence official said the Joint Chiefs have been skeptical of the administration's argument that it had the facts to back up its belief in Assad's guilt. The full extent of US cooperation with Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar in assisting the rebel opposition in Syria has yet to come to light. The Obama administration has never publicly admitted its role in creating what the CIA calls a rat line, a back-channel highway into Syria. The rat line, authorized in early 2012, was used to funnel weapons and ammunition from Libya via southern Turkey and across the Syrian border to the opposition. Many of those in Syria who ultimately received the weapons were jihadists, some of them affiliated with al-Qaeda. By the end of 2012, it was believed throughout the American intelligence community that the rebels were losing the war. Erdogan was pissed, the former intelligence official said, and felt he was left hanging on the vine. It was his money, and the cut-off was seen as a betrayal. The MIT was running the political liaison with the rebels, and the gendarmerie handled military logistics, on the scene advice and training, including training in chemical warfare. Stepping up Turkey's role in spring 2013 was seen as the key to its problems there. Erdogan knew that if he stopped his support of the jihadists, it would be all over. The Saudis could not support the war because of logistics, the distances involved, and the difficulty of moving weapons and supplies. Erdogan's hope was to instigate an event that would force the US to cross the red line, but Obama didn't respond in March and April. There was no public sign of discord when Erdogan and Obama met on 16th May 2013 at the White House. Obama said that they'd agreed that Assad needs to go. Obama acknowledged that there was evidence that weapons had been used, but added it is important for us to make sure that we're able to get more specific information about what exactly is happening there. The foreign policy expert told me that the account he had originated from Donilon. According to the expert, Erdogan had sought the meeting to demonstrate to Obama that the red line had been crossed and had brought Fidan along to state the case. When Erdogan tried to draw Fidan into the conversation and Fidan began speaking, Obama cut him off and said, "We know." Erdogan tried to bring Fidan in a second time, and Obama cut him off and said, "We know." At that point, an exasperated Erdogan said, "But your red line has been crossed." And the expert told me Donilon said Erdogan fucking waved his finger at the president inside the White House. Obama then pointed at Fidan and said, "We know what you're doing with the radicals in Syria." Donilon, who joined the question, who didn't respond to questions about this story, the Turkish foreign ministry didn't respond. Erdogan, Fidan, and Davutoglu sitting at a table. Beyond that, she said, "I'm not going to read out the details of their discussions." Which is pretty dramatic, isn't it? So essentially saying that, this was a put-up job by the Turks, and I think it clearly was in the context of the subsequent leak we saw on YouTube. I think, my conclusions are firstly that President Obama displayed some bravery in staring down his more recalcitrant allies like Prime Minister Erdogan. I'll put up a photograph of Prime Minister Erdogan, who I think is playing fast and loose with Turkish foreign policy. President Museveni, at a rally attended by thousands of Ugandans, said gays deserve to be punished severely because homosexuality is criminal and it is so cruel. The authorities searching for missing Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 raced to investigate a series of potential black box pings in the Indian Ocean. A senior official has reportedly claimed that the plane was steered around Indonesian airspace. And I return back to Thomas Pynchon's Bleeding Edge. No matter how the official narrative of this turns out, it seemed to Heidi these are the places we should be looking, not in newspapers or television, but at the margins. Graffiti, uncontrolled utterances, bad dreamers who sleep in public and scream in their sleep. Moscow told Washington officially it has no intention of invading Ukraine, and Washington told Moscow that for all the demented rhetoric, it does not want to expand NATO to either Ukraine or Georgia. This is Pepe Escobar. In my humble opinion, the US cannot pivot to Asia and to Ukraine at the same time. Interesting quote from an article in Bloomberg: America is clearly right up against the front door of China, and that's indeed a fact. That's what I mean about that. Whenever I use that image of the snake, it's blockading and encircling. The IMF and the World Bank will hold their spring meetings in Washington this week. Currency markets: the euro 137.05, dollar index 80.40, yen 103.13. Had a little bounce off just below 104, Swiss franc 0.8915, pound 165.74, Aussie 0.279. This is after touching 0.9308 on April 4th, which was the strongest level since November the 2nd. India rupee below 60 at 59.98. That's all around the potential for a conclusive outcome in favour of Narendra Modi. South Korean won 1055.50, touched 1050.89, the strongest level since January the 2nd. Rial 223.72, the Egyptian pound 697.43, and the South African rand 1054.94. That's a 3-month high. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the dollar index. The Fed is due to release minutes on April 9. Minutes of its March 18-19 meeting, and of course that's when Yellen said that the central bank might start raising borrowing costs around 6 months after ending its asset purchase program, and I think that caught a lot of people off guard because I think she hardened the central bank's position. Euro dollar were around this 137 level. I think Draghi is some ways or times away from any QE program, but the fact that he's raised it has softened the euro. Dollar yen 103.13. Holcim and Lafarge agreed a merger to create the world's biggest cement maker. Commodity markets: gold is above 1300 at 1301.74. I remain bearish, but I think it could tick a little bit higher. Crude oil 100.76. And I'm, for one, am looking to resell that. Coming to Africa, absentee Bouteflika dominates Algerian presidential poll at a packed sports hall in western Algeria. Portraits of President Abdelaziz Bouteflika gaze down on supporters rallying for his re-election, but the leader himself, weakened by a stroke a year ago, is a no-show. Throughout campaigning for the April 17 polls, Bouteflika has remained mostly out of the public eye, apart from brief television appearances, as he has done since falling ill. Campaigning by proxy. I like that idea. And somebody else saying, look at the neighborhood around us, make a comparison. Algeria is like an island of peace. I'll put up a photograph of him meeting John Kerry. Bashir orders the release of political detainees, relaxing restrictions on parties and media. So he's softening up a little bit as well. South African all-share up 5.83% at a record high. The ANC faces its toughest election on May 7, as some voters expected quicker improvement in their lives 20 years after the end of apartheid, Party Treasurer General Zweli Mkhize said. And this is the point that Zuma's been making. There is a whole mismatch between expectations and the reality of the availability of resources. The question after 20 years, how can I still be living in a shack? They won more than 60% of the vote, and every vote since 1994. I think they're going well below 60. Dollar Rand at a 3-month high, 1054. We break here, we go to 10 quickly. Egyptian pound still around that 697 level. The Egyptian stock market has lost 11.492% since the 25th of March. It's still up 11.73% this year, and is the strongest performing sub-Saharan African market in terms of absolute returns. The Nigeria All-Share down 5.2% this year. Nigeria's economy surpassed South Africa as the largest on the continent after the West African nation overhauled its GDP for the first time in 2 decades. The size of the economy is estimated at $491 billion for 2013. That compares with the World Bank's GDP figures of $262.6 billion in 2012 and $384.3 billion for South Africa. The jump in the official GDP figure ranks Nigeria as the 26th biggest economy in the world, up from 33rd. Interesting comments, though. South Africa, however, has one of the best regulatory frameworks, very deep and embedded manufacturing sector. They were the go-to country for investment, but you can see more diffusion now. Ghana Stock Exchange up 11.11% in 2014, but all of that has been eroded by the currency. Zambia 12-month yields have risen to a 4-year high on bank measures. Yields on 1-year papers at 16.48%, highest since October 2009. They made a decision to increase electricity prices by almost 29% for mining companies. That's obviously going to hit those folks hard as well, and they're struggling with the lower copper price. Zimbabwe's economy shrank by 49% between 2000 and last year. The biggest contributor to that loss is deindustrialization, since most companies have closed. Then another report on Bloomberg talking about how the economy is suffering from a slump in consumer spending and will probably be beset by deflation in coming months. This is the finance ministry. Bob Diamond's Atlas Mara bought a stake in the Rwandan Development Bank. Mr. Diamond sees the investment in Botswana and Rwanda as only the start of his Africa adventure. This is the beginning, he said in an interview from Kigali. Watch this space. Very interesting piece about here's how to unlock Africa's economic potential. This is Jim O'Neill, and a very interesting piece. And then he gives a word of advice. Vitalism, you need the backing of better governance. Here's a modest suggestion for African ministers, officials, and heads of business. Turn up to meetings on time. That kind of thing isn't hard and makes a good impression. How I wish they would. President Kenyatta met with Christian Turner, Bob Godek, David Angel, and Jeff Tooth. I like the photograph where they all seem to be having a good chuckle. They assured me of their commitment to support my government in eliminating terror threats, and terror concerns are sky high right now. Kenya Airways' Dreamliner, I'll put up a photograph of it on touchdown at JKIA during the official reception in Nairobi on April 5. Titus said, we had planned to have this aircraft about 3 to 4 years ago, but this delayed for a number of technical reasons with the manufacturing process. But in the end, the dream has come true. Kenya Airways is up 5.5% last week and is up again this week. The Nairobi All-Share is up 4.939% in 2014. The NSE 20 is up 1.39% in 2014. And finally, I'll put up a photograph of the Range Rovers, which tried to come down some incredible off-road area that we've taken it into. And finally, a Jaguar that I rather enjoy driving around, I must admit. Once again, thank you for stopping by.